So welcome everybody to the Swiss School of Latin American Studies Zoom symposium today, November 13, 2020. And I think that we're going to be having an incredibly interesting discussion. We're going to go through a whirlwind of topics with our three phenomenal panelists. So I think that we're going to have a very lively and provocative discussions. So please, I think, everybody's quite well-versed with the Zoom etiquette. So if you want to ask a question, you can also either raise your hand with the reactions button, or you can put your name on the chat. You can write your question in the chat, or we can, you can also turn on your camera if I call your name and you can ask your question, or we can read out the question for you. So today, it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome our three panelists, our keynote speakers of today. So Dr. Brantley Nicholson from Georgia College, he in the United States of America. He's joining us today. He's going to be speaking first. Then we have Dr. Juan Fernando Palacio from the UPV in Medellín, Colombia, and he will be speaking second. And we have PD Dr. Claudia Brühwiler from the University of St. Gallen here in Switzerland. My name is Rocío Robinson. I am the program director of the Swiss School of Latin American Studies, the SSLAS, and I'm also embedded at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. I'm currently in Zurich right now, and I welcome everybody from all over the world who's joining us. I think we will have some guests from different parts of Latin America, different parts of Europe, and also different parts of the world in general. So again, I will be recording this session because I have received several requests from the persons that are not able to join us live, and to facilitate the diffusion of all of this information that we will be exposed to today, where I'm going to also be uploading the recording onto our SSLAS website. So our SSLAS website, our Swiss School of Latin American Studies website is, I'm going to write it on the chat as well, is sslas.org. So it's sslas.org. And there, hopefully by Monday or early next week, you will be able to also see the presentations, the PowerPoint presentations. I will be uploading that, as well as hopefully the video, if the technology permits it that quickly. So again, here, we welcome everybody to our session today on the impacts of the USA presidential election on Latin America and Latinos. We have our three phenomenal keynote speakers and panelists, and we're gonna, again, I'm gonna repeat, we're gonna get started with a presentation that's gonna last approximately 10 minutes from Professor Dr. Brantley Nicholson from Georgia College. Then we're gonna be followed by Dr. Juan Fernando Palacio from the UPV in Medellín, Colombia. And afterwards, PD Dr. Claudia Brühwiler from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland will be making also her 10-minute presentation. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Let's just dive straight into it. So thank you, Brantley. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to Rocío and the Swiss School of Latin American Studies for this invitation. I also look forward to sharing the virtual stage here with Claudia and Juan Fernando. Also, I'm very flattered, and thank you very much to all of my friends, colleagues, and students that have showed up. That's incredibly flattering, and I'm also excited because I know, based on all the familiar faces, there's a lot of intellectual firepower in this virtual room. So I think that we might get into a really good Q&A afterward. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so really I'm going to focus on some meta points here, really work on the macro view. And I know that Juan Fernando and Claudia are going to dive into the micro a little bit more, and then we can tease out the finer points in the Q&A. But just for an overview of the relationship between Latin America and the United States, we really need to go back to independence, and I'm going to move very quickly here. And that's that among the independence movements, you had foundational writers both in the United States and throughout Latin America, such as Simón Bolívar or Thomas Jefferson in the United States. And they really viewed the Americas through the prism of Pan America. They always viewed this as a collective project or a natural coming together. They thought of themselves as inheriting humanity from Europe, and that really this was going to be a new project in humanity throughout the Americas. This movement really hit a low point. Sorry, before I get to that, well, this was replicated in the United States or echoed in the Monroe Doctrine, which came out about 5 years after Bolivar wrote the Jamaican Letters, in which he laid out his plan. And of course, the Monroe Doctrine on the surface was very emancipatory in that it tried to keep out old world powers out of the Americas and really sort of viewed the Americas as a space for new independent nations. Of course, there's a lot of criticism that goes beyond the surface here, much of it justified, in that the United States already saw itself as industrializing and becoming a superpower quicker than most Latin American countries, and that this could arguably be setting the stage of Latin America as a sort of North American testing and playground. This notion of Pan America hit a low point in the turn of the century. That's coming into the end of the 19th century, coming into the 20th century, through what is known as the Modernistas. This was a Latin American intellectual movement in both philosophy, politics, and literature that was premised largely on a rejection of North American notions. Already, there's a rift beginning to form that had a lot of fault lines that shared or showed echoes of Europe. That is, we started to see this rift between Catholic America and Anglo America, which would run parallel to Northern Europe and Southern Europe. And then we come into the turn of the 21st century, which really where we are now effectively. Starting in the 90s, we start to see a movement back to an emphatic celebration of Pan America. Of course, free trade agreements, globalization, NAFTA, just with the focus on North America. But this has also happened alongside the neo-nationalisms that maybe took us all by surprise 4 or 5 years ago, but now that we're becoming more fluent in, or at least making a bigger attempt to understand. So really where we find ourselves now in the 21st century is we kind of have both. We have this Pan America redux and we have the neo-nationalisms at the same time, which is why we see such rapid swings, not just in the political swings, not just in the United States, but in Latin America as well. So we see a sort of renovated Monroe Doctrine. At the same time, we see from the US perspective a stepping back, a real lack of appetite for intervention in Latin America. And this is also, of course, coincides with China's New Silk Road projects. That is, as the United States takes a step back on the global stage, but more acutely in Latin America, where we've had so much influence and intervention, China is very happy to fill the void, that is both through direct investment and also through political pressure. Now, for more of the topic of the day, what does the shift from a Trump to a Biden presidency look like? Well, I think that really we have to draw a line between tone and policy and actual policy here. In terms of tone, we really don't have, we could hardly have a starker contrast. If we think of Trump's rhetoric and iconography, of course, this is an iconography that most familiarly we would see through the wall, which of course was really the emblem of his 2016 campaign. And also subsequently the imagery of children in cages. Joe Biden is just completely different than that. This is also, it should be said, Joe Biden already comes into this with a natural multilateralism, and that he is the president, having not even been inaugurated on day one, will be the president that has visited Latin America the most times as an official dignitary. That's 16 times. And that is not even close. No other American president comes close. To put that in context, Donald Trump only went to Latin America once, and that was for a G20 summit in Buenos Aires. So he wasn't going to visit a Latin American country. He was going to participate in the G20. or Barack Obama, who only visited Latin America 4 times. So he's coming in with a real fluency of the issues, a real fluency of the people on the ground. So we see, at least tonally, a sort of technocratic return on the surface. However, in terms of actual policy, there's no early indication that anything is going to change dramatically or drastically. And we can get into a bit more of that in the Q&A discussion. Of course, there are going to be some changes, but it's difficult to envision, at least now, any real dramatic shifts in policy. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about one micro issue here that I know Claudia is gonna get into as someone that focuses on this from more of an American perspective. But the issue of Florida, and it's been very exciting, interesting, and amusing for those of us that study Latin America, that over the past couple of weeks, everyone's decided that the Latino vote is really more than just one person, that there are really, it's a bunch of different groups from different parts of Hispanic America and then live in different parts of the country. But in Florida in particular, I think that this is pretty fascinating and needs some historical context. So what happened to who is the Latino in Florida? Really, to understand this, we have to go all the way back to the Cold War, because I think that if we see an aftershock of the Cold War anywhere right now, it's in southern Florida. So during the Cold War, of course, most people on the call will be very familiar with this. There was US intervention in Latin America. I don't know where you stand on it, but a lot of it was even the United States has admitted retrospectively that a lot of it was unjustified, backed presidents and authoritarian rulers that perhaps they would, given hindsight, would not have backed. But this sort of led to a populist rise, or laid the groundwork for a populist rise in Latin America, known as the Pink Wave in the early 2000s, that were still really campaigning against the memory of quote unquote Yankee imperialism or North American imperialism. And this brought a lot of leaders to power. Some of them moderate, some of them centrist, some of them left wing, Hugo Chavez being the example par excellence of someone who's extremely left wing, which took over Venezuela. Venezuela is in a much more precarious situation now, which has led to a lot of immigration to Florida. So the interesting thing here is since about 2010, any centrist or center-right, or occasionally even center-left candidate for president in any Latin American country is always running against the ghost of Hugo Chavez, who was running himself against the ghost of North American imperialism. The interesting thing now is this running against the ghost of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela has now come to the United States. So in many ways, this presents the United States kind of joining Latin America in this whipsawing back and forth populism. A few more points that I'll throw out there, and we can delve more into in the Q&A. Really, it might sound kind of glib to say this, but perhaps the single most thing that could have the biggest impact on Latin America doesn't have to do directly with Latin America, and that is the US and China trade war. And I think that we could make projections and say that the US-China trade war won't not exist. This won't cease to exist, but perhaps it will be ameliorated under a Biden presidency. And a stronger global economy, and especially an expansion and development within China, is one of the things that benefit Latin America the most, especially in the Andean region and the Pacific Rim, because any expansion in China is going to bring along with it a commodity boom. And a lot of these countries have bankrolled themselves over the past 15 or 20 years and continue to do, based on selling commodities to China. And that is Bolivia, that's Chile, that's Peru, that's Colombia to a certain extent. The flip side of that is that a strong dollar is not good for all Latin American countries, especially those that aren't in the Andean region. And here we would think countries, perhaps more like Venezuela or Argentina, and that's that they have a lot of US dollar denominated debt. So a stronger dollar makes that debt a little bit more difficult to surface. And I don't want to bore everyone with such wonky language. So I think that I will throw out some red meat to wake everyone back up before we move back to the next panel. And that's that I would say that if we could think of just one single thing, one shift in policy that would be just silver bullet, instantly impactful throughout Latin America, it would be a shift in drug policy on behalf of the United States and Europe. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to hearing from my co-panelists and to the conversation afterward.
Thank you very much, Brantley, for laying out the stage for very interesting topics that are already surfacing through. There's already a lot to unpack there, but I think that we're going to save it for the Q&A and the panel discussion afterwards. So now we will make a smooth transition onto Dr. Juan Fernando Palacio's presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Robinson, thank you very much for your introduction and for your kind invitation to be here with you. It's a privilege to share this panel with Brantley and Claudia. And it's a privilege to be back in an event of the Swiss School of Latin American Studies. 4 years have passed from my last participation. I owe so much to this network, and I am so happy to meet you all and to meet all friends and colleagues here again. I hope that we can catch up soon, and I'm gonna quickly get to business because I know that time is short. So here I begin. In the last couple of weeks, we all witnessed what was probably the most consequential presidential election in our lives, not only for the future of the United States, but also for the stability of the international system. We cannot doubt that having a new resident in the White House definitely changes the tone and the substance of the US foreign policy. What is the nature of these changes? Well, bluntly speaking, we can say that the two keywords of Donald Trump's foreign policy have been, number one, abdication, and number two, impulse. Trump's lack of empathy, his lack of tact, his erratic behavior, and his disregard for traditional allies and for multilateralism damaged the United States' stand in the world and made the world a more unstable place to live in. I'm going to share my first slide with you. Can you please confirm to me if you see it?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. As you can see in the results of a recent Pew Research survey in the figure I'm sharing right now, the US moved from being a significantly respected and trusted country to having as its president one of the most distrusted leaders in the world. In contrast, regardless of whether we like the choices and actions of the United States abroad, we can all agree that the two keywords of the foreign policy of basically any other president of the United States in the last 100 years, and President Biden won't be the exception to this, the two keywords are number one, leadership, and number two, national interest. With Biden, the United States is poised to restore its relations with its allies from NATO to South Korea and to recover its leading voice in the multilateral arena. So the US projecting leadership again means that the US foreign policy is somehow back to normal, or quite so. Of course, Biden's leadership will be a diminished leadership, a wounded leadership, not only because the global center of power keeps moving towards the Pacific Ocean and towards China, but also because governments around the world, allies or not, will certainly exhibit less and less trust towards the United States, not directly because of President Biden, but basically because of the peculiar tastes of American voters who have proved to be unpredictable and quite bold in the last two presidential elections. Anyway, we can say that the change will be substantial. This change will be felt at the multilateral level and at the bilateral level. It will be felt in every continent, and it will certainly be felt in Latin America. So what does the Biden presidency mean for Latin America? Let's begin first by analyzing what the Trump presidency meant for the region. We can say that Trump's foreign policy towards Latin America was not very sophisticated and that the region was commonly not on his radar, with a few exceptions. Renegotiating NAFTA and reaching cooperation in migration control were his key priorities with Mexico. And Mexico silently made some concessions and managed to maintain the relations stable despite the political differences and the high risks of fracture. The US special relationship with Colombia survived, yet it became harshly centered on drug control, and both political leaders and the media in Colombia registered the change of manners in bilateral negotiation and cooperation. One of Trump's more active fronts was certainly Venezuela. However, his actions to overturn Venezuela's regime were late, were insufficient, considerably disconnected from other joint efforts towards the same purpose, and ultimately ineffective. In short, the relations with Latin America during the last 4 years remained rather stable, if distant. Under Trump's presidency, the Inter-American agenda didn't advance bigly. Relations became highly transactional, as with everything involving the master of the art of a deal, and the cases of closer cooperation followed the logic of political affinities, which were in many, from which the obvious example is President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. Having that context in mind, what does Biden mean for Latin America? Let me first mention two specific areas in which one in which I see a dramatic change coming and other in which I don't. First, a big expected change has been the policy announced by Biden's campaign for tackling the issue of mass migration in Central America, addressing the direct roots of poverty and instability in these countries. All indicates that he plans to spend a large budget on that strategy. Such long-term approach would certainly be more effective to tackle the issue and could alleviate tremendous suffering in this region. This is a big depart from Trump's superficial approach. My second point, however, is that the Biden presidency doesn't have great incentives to move away from the goal of promoting a regime change in countries such as Venezuela or Cuba. The tactics are going to change for sure, but not the intention, no matter how much Maduro tries to flirt with Biden to try to gain some indulgences in the new government. Now, more generally speaking, the main changes of the Biden era for the region can be summarized, in my opinion, in three notions. Notion number one, accommodation. Notion number two, widening. And notion number three, expectation. First notion, accommodation. We can expect that governments across the region will quickly adapt to the narrative and policy preferences of the new president in order to make the best out of the relations with the United States, which is the number one trading partner and donor for many countries and one of the major ones for all the rest. This accommodation will take place quickly and smoothly. Most countries will do it joyfully, but others will face risk and embarrassment. Although the case of Brazil is very clear, a less known and yet very illustrative case is Colombia. The right-wing government of Colombia has been regularly accused of being negligent in protecting the lives of social leaders, as well as the integrity of the peace agreements with the FARC reached by the previous administration. We can expect that the Duque government will work harder from now on correcting that impression. Moreover, the Colombian embassy in Washington has been seriously accused of trying to help the Trump campaign during the election. We also can expect some rectifications there. Second notion, widening, very briefly, Biden's agenda for Latin America will be larger and more comprehensive, from human rights to trade, to foreign investment, to health, to climate change. The different tone and wider agenda will indeed be refreshing and positive for the region. And the third notion is expectation. Political leaders are hopeful, even anxious across the region, and many dream, as always when a power transition takes place in the US, that this will be the time when a strong cooperation will flourish and big development gains will follow suit. But after the honeymoon ends, expectations tend to fade. The truth is that we don't know yet how ambitious Biden's White House will be in its cooperation objectives with Latin America. We know that Biden knows the region better than Trump, as Brantley said. We know that he is a tested diplomat and that he understands the strategic and geopolitical challenges of his country, which therefore means that he gets the long-term strategic importance of Latin America for the US. However, Biden created an unfortunate precedent in his presidential campaign. Look, if Biden failed so miserably in forging a more assertive campaign for addressing the concerns of the Latino vote in Florida, a key swing state, how can we be certain that his foreign policy won't neglect Latin America as it usually happens? Summing up, the Biden presidency might provide the strongest cooperation with Latin America in our generation, and it could be just, or it could just become one more instance in which Latin America is once again ignored. Latin America has been neglected before, and it can be neglected again. However, my last thought is less pessimistic because it has to do with the wider global effects of the Biden presidency beyond diplomatic relations. Arguably, no country has more soft power and cultural influence in the world than the United States, and the attitudes, values, and style coming from the President of the United States becomes contagious during his term. So his impact is not only diplomatic, but also political and social and cultural. Tiny things coming from that office can spark big and small cultural revolutions everywhere. And this is where I see the biggest depart from Trump's presidency. Regardless of the level of diplomatic engagement that the US and the region will have in the next 4 years, we can expect that the progressive leanings of Biden's presidency will have an impact beyond foreign affairs observable in politics, society, and culture. If this is true for the world as a whole, this is especially true for Latin America, a traditional region of influence. As you can see in the picture, a cute little baby was born just a couple of days ago in Barranquilla, Colombia, and was named Biden Antonio by his parents. This news is amazing and, in my opinion, is the best example of the massive impact that the office of the President of the United States has. When I learned about Biden Antonio, I was watching the news with my mother on the TV, and my mom, she's very cunning, and she immediately pointed out, a ningún niño lo pusieron Trump. A ningún niño lo pusieron Trump. No one in Colombia named their son after Trump in the last 4 years. And she's so right. No one did such a thing. I believe this tiny example shows the magnitude of Trump's utter inability to cause great inspiration among Latin Americans. In contrast, this example also shows that when the rhetoric is based on principles, US presidents, including Biden, have an extraordinary ability to project inspiration both in Latin America and in the rest of the world. So for sure, the evolution of Biden's presidential term and its several effects in Latin America will be something of the biggest interest for us to examine in the next 4 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan Fernando. Why was the baby named Biden Antonio and not Jose Biden? But anyway, we'll leave those questions for
Biden Fernando, as Juan Fernando.
Exactly. So you have already mentioned many keywords, which I would like to come back to, such as China, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil. And I really hope that we can come back to many of these keywords in our panel discussion and Q&A. But now we move on to our third presentation of today with Dr. Claudia Brühwiler, who's going to speak to us about Latinos.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I have to preface this by saying that I'm very much like the departing president, or we hope he's departing anytime soon. I'm a bit of an imposter in this round because my main area of research is actually has not really to do with Latinos or Latin America. My main area is conservatism. And so I have been looking at this mainly from the angle, why have Latinos been voting for President Trump? Why have they been voting against the Democratic Party this election around too? So this is where I'm coming from, and I hope this suits everyone's interest. I've seen there are a lot of Americans in the round. You probably would be able to jump in on this at any time, but we'll come to that later. Plus, we have our very own St. Gallen specialist of Latino studies anyway in our midst, Yvette Sanchez, will probably be able to talk circles around this subject, but bear with me for the moment. So we see this phenomenon every 4 years. Every 4 years, America is discussing the importance of the Latino vote. There is this notion that the Latino vote is simply the sleeping giant that may be the decisive factor in every presidential election. You have here a quote from researchers that have looked at this, who are also saying that every 4 years, the Latino vote is depicted by the media and political analysts as having the potential to determine the outcome of the presidential election. And every 4 years, there is a tendency to make the same assumption, namely that Latino voters will be dominantly going for the Democratic Party and that they mainly care about one issue, and that is immigration policy and maybe foreign policy with a focus on Latin America. And every 4 years, we also see presidential candidates and those running in the primaries unpacking their Spanish skills and trying to woo their Hispanic voters with what is called Hispandering, so pandering to Latino voters by implying interest and also sympathy for their causes and culture. And that often backfires. So 4 years ago, we had Hillary Clinton publish on her campaign website 7 ways in which Hillary Clinton is like your abuela, with nice little GIFs and snapshots of her apparently being like a stereotypical abuela of whatever origin, which backfired pretty much immediately, with Latino voters telling Hillary that she is in no way like their abuelas. Here just 2 examples pointing out in what privilege Hillary Clinton basically was raised, how her family was raised, and how little Hillary Clinton actually understood about Latino voters. And we have to say this is a bit of a recurring theme, lack of understanding of what the Latino vote actually comes up to. And this year has been no exception. So just for those who are a bit less familiar with the demographics in the United States, how many voters are we talking about? Well, the Latino community, or the Latino communities in plural, have been the fastest growing ethnic minority in the United States. We're currently at over 60 million Latinos in the United States, and 4 in 5 of these have citizenship. So this year we had a record number of over 30 million US Latinos being eligible to vote. And what's interesting is that they are concentrated in certain states where it's actually interesting for both parties to woo them, because of those with the biggest Latino groups, 2 are swing states, or one has now become a bit of a swing state. One is Florida, that has already been mentioned. The other is Arizona. And then we have Texas. Some are arguing that Texas might turn into a swing state thanks to Latino voters. New York, California, there are less surprises to be expected. But again, places where Hispandering and other forms of Latino outreach are quite common and important, particularly during primaries. So a sizable chunk of the American electorate, 13% of American voters are Latinos or identify as Latinos. And they tend to be treated in the media and also in parts of scholarship as if they were a block of Democrats. But the past has shown that there is a sizable number who do not side with democratic issues. And we can take here a short trip down memory lane, and we see that there is a stable percentage of around 30% that tend to vote with Republican candidates. So dating back to Ronald Reagan, we see that he secured more than a third of their vote. The record was with George W. Bush, who in the second time around got to 40%. Then we had a short dip, and in each case of the presidents who did, Republican presidents that did particularly well with Latino voters, we saw that they actually addressed Latino voters to an extent that has not been done by their predecessors and also by their successors. So if we look at Ronald Reagan, you would have this very Cold War stereotypical image of his foreign policy, and it would then surprise that he is essentially the last president to grant an amnesty that greatly benefited illegal migrants, mainly from South America. Then we have George W. Bush, who has been vilified on the European continent as one of the worst presidents. But from the perspective of Latino voters, he has a bit of a better record, thanks to what he did as a governor in Texas, in terms of educational policies, access to medical and medical emergency care and things like that, and his very decisive Latino outreach. And the Republican Party has been very concerned with keeping that level of Latino engagement, which is why after their loss in 2012, they issued the so-called autopsy report, in which they particularly also addressed their lack of success in 2012 with Latino voters and said, we have to change our stance on immigration. We have to open up our views on that, and we have to work more on our Latino outreach, which is why in 2016, during the primary debates, we saw a lot of Spanish speaking also from Republican candidates, and we saw several Republican candidates with Latino roots, namely Ted Cruz and Senator Marco Rubio. So again, this year, everyone was talking again about the so-called sleeping giant and how the sleeping giant would favor the Democrats, particularly with regard looking back at what the Trump era has brought in terms of immigration policy. Juan Fernando has mentioned the horrific images that we have been confronted with, so did Brantley. And then during election night, when everyone was looking at the County Miami-Dade, there was a huge surprise on certain faces. I'm sure Brantley was probably a lot less surprised than certain CNN anchors. But if we look at the vote, we see that this year in blue, you have those who voted for Biden. In red, you have the Trump voters. And you see that actually the percentage of Latinos voting Republican, this time around voting Trump, is very similar to what we've seen in the past. So it's circling around a third. It has actually, Trump has increased the percentage in comparison to 2016. And it has led many to question why. Why are these Latino voters voting for a Republican president with such a terrible immigration policy and such an inhuman treatment of migrants, and also such an incendiary language? I mean, we all think back to 2016 when he centered his campaign on immigration, when he talked about bad hombres, rapists, etc., coming from Latin America. So why vote for this man? One thing is that we just have a solid base of Latino voters that have been aligned with the GOP for a very long time, that are basically part of the anti-communist branch of the party that has emerged in the Cold War years, and that have been courted early on by the GOP. And the GOP, well, the Republican Party has been very early on being also making the symbolic gestures that counted in terms of appointments. So for instance, the first Latina treasurer was appointed by a Republican, not by a Democrat. Then we see a general underestimation by both parties and by the press and pundits of intra-Latino differences. I think this doesn't come as a surprise to the American researchers or to people focusing on Latino culture. During Hillary's campaign, there was talk about a Latino firewall that would propel her in certain counties. And one has to say that doesn't exist. We see the same differences among Latino voters dependent on income and education as we see among white voters. And the other factor that comes in is geographic background. If you have your roots in Mexico, that will lead to different voter behavior than if you are of Cuban origin, etc. Another factor that has become increasingly important is religious affiliation. We see the share of Latino Catholics decline, and we have a tendency that those who are evangelicals or Pentecostals or Protestant in general will side with the Republican Party because they care more about social conservative issues, about value issues than other policy areas. And that leads me to the next point, that there has been a tendency, again, by both parties to treat Latino voters as single issue voters. And while I generally have a problem with that term, and I do believe that there are no single issue voters in general, it's particularly untrue if you treat a whole ethnic group as single issue voters. So immigration reform and discrimination are not at the forefront for a majority of Latino voters. And there has been a tendency, particularly by the Democratic Party, to completely neglect that. Another issue that is not addressed as openly when it comes to the Latino vote is, aside from the diversity of Latinos in general, there is also the question of, when are you still a Latino? We have a very high intermarriage rate. We have a rising share of Latinos who also see themselves as whites. There's a wonderful quote I recently found by an activist who said, we're white, we're black, we're indigenous, we're mixed, figure it out. It's like we're swing states, that's who we are. And so all the Hispandering that I described in the beginning, all these cliche tactics of mobilizing Hispanic voters have to fall flat. If you're underestimating the diversity and the differences and also the dynamics that determine the future of this group, which isn't really a group at the end of the day, then you will not be very successful in your outreach efforts. So just as much as this caricature doesn't really capture the differences in policy between Democrats and Republicans, this much is also the idea of a voto Latino, a caricature. Because let's remember, the Democratic President Barack Obama was very good at deportations as well.
Wow, thank you very much, Claudia. There is also a lot there to unpack, and we're going to be coming back to a lot of these different points that you have put on the table. But I think I will take the liberty to ask each of the panelists one or two questions directly, so that we jumpstart the conversation, and then afterwards we will absolutely jump into the Q&A. But please, as the panelists are responding, feel free also to ask your questions. You can either write it in the chat or turn your camera on if it's not on already, and ask the question yourself. So I think I'm going to start off with Brantley. And maybe I'll jump into a bit of a provocative question in something that you mentioned. So how relevant is the Monroe Doctrine now? Obama, for example, wanted to throw out the Monroe Doctrine and start afresh and normalize relations with Cuba. but it all ended up being a policy of neglect, not only for Cuba, but for large parts of the region. So, you know, isn't it a fact that the reality is that Latin America is not really a priority anymore for the United States of America? So do you think Biden can bridge this current gap in relations with Latin America? And will he be able to perhaps promote more democracy in the region?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Rocío. Where does the Monroe Doctrine stand now? I would say that it pretty much doesn't exist, and that probably started to fade well before Trump. But Trump, I think that what happened, or not only with Trump, but with a lot of these neo-nationalist presidents, that what we saw was a real lack of appetite for global multilateralism that perhaps was simmering for a long time, and caught a lot of us by surprise, really came to the surface. So like I said in the talk, I think what you will get, and also Juan, Fernando, and Claudia alluded to, I think that you'll see a real shift in tone. You will see a natural progression in multilateralism, but that's because we're starting from practically zero at this point. So, and I do think tone matters. So you say like promoting democracy, for example, well, whether we like it or not, for better or worse, it's very important that the United States does set an example in tone. They perhaps we don't have the appetite or maybe even ability on the ground to intervene in Latin American countries. And, you know, a lot of us probably think that that's a good thing. There is a real space for diplomacy and tact. And I think that that's where we're going to see a shift. But I think that really what we saw in the attempted coup in Venezuela a couple of years ago, where we've talked about it, you know, we made all the symbolic gestures we possibly could toward Juan Guaido, the presumptive or the aspirant president, in the attempted overthrow of Nicolás Maduro. He was invited to a State of the Union address for Donald Trump. I mean, he was on the phone with Mike Pence consistently, given all kinds of moral support, and attempting a coup to overthrow Nicolás Maduro. When the rubber hit the road, we completely abandoned him. We did absolutely nothing. So I think that was just case in point. Rhetorically, I think we will do a lot. When it comes to actually intervening or trying to promote democracy, or even, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, even combating the rise in China, I don't foresee a lot of actual policy or meaningful action. And my co-panelists may disagree, but that's just a hunch.
Great. Any reply? We'll come back to that, because I do also, thank you very much, Brantley. I do also want to ask a question to Juan Fernando, because I know that he has to be leaving in a bit before our time is up. But in picking up in some of the comments that Brantley said, so Juan Fernando, will Biden's approach be guided by a neoliberal economic agenda, even if there's more interest in engaging in a multilateral fashion? So you stated that Biden will surely differ greatly from Trump's hardball approach to threats, you know, tariffs and waging economic sanctions for countries that are antagonistic towards the USA. But will Biden's soft diplomacy be effective?
Thank you, Rocío, for the question. First of all, I would like to follow up about this Monroe Doctrine Brantley was talking about. I agree with Brantley. I would like to say that that it seems that thinking about the Monroe Doctrine is not a very good guide anymore to think about inter-American relations. Number one, when you think of on geopolitical terms, what is really strategic for the United States is Mexico and the Caribbean, but the rest of Latin America, not that much. And number two, well, Europe and more China are competing more and more against the US interests in Latin America, and especially in South America. So we shouldn't talk so much in this era, in my opinion, about the Monroe Doctrine in its traditional conception, at least, but more rather as the new Silk Road era. This is not the Monroe Doctrine era, but the new Silk Road era, to follow Brantley's ideas in his presentation. This is, I think, the notion that helps us to understand where we are. Regarding the agenda of President Biden in Latin America, I would say that it would be a liberal agenda indeed. It will be an agenda of trade promotion and investment promotion and promotion of economic interests. We shouldn't expect a Biden presidency moved only by ideology, but also by national interest. And national interest in the United States also involves economic interests in the region. So what we should expect from a Biden presidency, both in Latin America and elsewhere in the world, is a sort of balance between ideology and realpolitik. I think that it should have a big dose of realism if it wants to cope with the challenges of China and Russia and the struggle for power in other regions in the world, because otherwise an ideologized Biden presidency will be even more dangerous for the stability of the international system than the lack of diplomatic matters of the previous president.
Thank you very much, Juan Fernando. Any responses from Brantley's side, perhaps, or?
No, I think we're largely in agreement there, and that's that. I think the new Silk Road era is probably more, if we did have to choose one meta description, one globalist description for what's going to be happening in Latin America, I would say that if you had to choose one, you'd say probably the new Silk Road is a better description, and the United States is more on defense in the hemisphere than they're used to being. But at the same time, I think the hemisphere needs both the United States and China, but more than their direct intervention, they need the US and China to get along.
Mm-hmm. And I think so far we have also failed to mention the importance of other foreign powers besides China, such as Russia and Iran. I mean, Russia and Iran also are stepping in further and further and deeper into the Latin American region. But maybe now we make a shift also, so I can ask a question to Claudia, and then of course we will start getting the members of the audience also engaged in our discussions. So Claudia, do you think that Biden will do away immediately with the Trump administration's draconian immigration policies? And can Biden reform the broken American immigration system?
Yes and no. So he has clearly said that he will want to reinstate DACA formally. I mean, DACA has been what's the actual name? Deferred Action for Children Arrivals, has been defended by the Supreme Court, but it has been formally been attacked by the Trump administration. And he said that he intends to reinstate it and to expand it. On certain other issues, it's going to be a bit more complicated. So it's clear that the travel bans for Muslim countries, which does not affect Latin America, will be repealed. He will set new rules with regards to refugee admission, because at the moment, the whole asylum system is essentially broken. The Trump administration has, for lack of a better word, abuse the pandemic as a way of refusing to treat any applications for asylum. There have been horrific cases of people who have been tortured and under threat as political dissidents in their home countries. There are cases from Nicaragua that have not even been able to present their cases, defend their cases, and have been immediately been sent back home and been under threat there again. So this will stop relatively soon, but and we also should see a going back on these agreements that keeps refugees in Mexico and Guatemala until their cases are looked at in the United States. So I think we'll see very quickly steps forward on these areas, since Biden has promised that. But whether they can really fix the immigration system as that, I'm more hesitant, because that is something that he cannot do by executive order. He will need the Senate for that. And we are still waiting on Georgia. I hope the Georgia people are all intending to vote in a certain direction. So that's definitely going to be a trickier thing. And I mean, we've seen Barack Obama's administration also failing at that. I mean, the DREAM Act that we often talk about has been a bipartisan attempt at reforming it, but it has not been successful, couldn't pass. And what I just wanted to add on what Fernando and Brantley have been discussing, the importance of tone. And just because I saw the question from Cámara Suizo-Mexicana de Comercio, that one of the interesting aspects of the Trump administration was that oftentimes the tone was more harsh than what actually was done. So not only in terms of bilateral relations with Mexico, but just quite generally, the economic policy has not gone in that protectionist direction that he promised his voters, and quite generally, he has never gone as far as he promised his voters, but had a lot of effect with his tonality. And in the same vein, we may not see those dramatic policy changes under a Biden administration, but we can see that the tonality will have a big effect too. Juan Fernando has talked about the soft power of the US government. I don't like the notion of soft power, but it captures that very nicely. And I think one of the first steps of the Biden presidency in that matter will be to go back to the tradition that a US president first visits his neighbors, so that he will first go to either Canada, Mexico, once the pandemic allows it, and not like Trump to Saudi Arabia. So these are small things, I think, that matter a lot in the end, because tone does affect the way relations are perceived and the way they go forward.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think we can, you did mention, also Brantley mentioned the importance of Florida. And now we see also how Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada are playing a key role. But let's go back to Mexico. Maybe we can start addressing some countries individually, the situation in some specific countries. So Brantley, Juan Fernando, any comments about Mexico?
So I'll leave an in-depth analysis to Juan Fernando or perhaps someone else in the field, because Mexico is not one of my stronger suits. But I will echo what Claudia said, and that I would not anticipate, or in answering the Mexican-Swiss Chamber of Commerce's question, I would not anticipate, for example, a reopening of the NAFTA agreement. Again, I don't think that. I think that the Democratic Party and certainly Joe Biden really hedged on those sort of issues, and I don't think that he is going to make a real shift there. But I mean, we keep saying it, its tone does matter, and especially for the investment community. I mean, if certainty is really, or a lack of doubt is what one of the most key factors in investment, especially foreign investment, I think tone and just lowering the temperature and dialogue will go a great distance here.
Thank you, Juan Fernando.
The most difficult questions for Juan Fernando. That's me. I'm not a Mexico expert.
I have more difficult questions to come, by the way.
I'm not a Mexico expert. I have to start by saying that. However, I believe that the diplomatic relations between the two countries won't change that much. There are several authors, both in Mexico and in the United States, such as Shannon O'Neill, for instance, who have been promoting a stronger agenda of cooperation between Mexico and the United States, and they complain, saying that if all the money and resources that had been invested in Afghanistan and Iraq had instead been invested in promoting development and political and economic stability in Mexico, things in the US would be far better than in today's situation. There is always high expectation about how a US president will address diplomatic relations with its neighbor in the South. We still need to see how ambitious Biden would like to be regarding its policy towards Mexico. There are many opportunities for cooperation. These opportunities need resources, and we are in the middle of a difficult budgetary situation for the US government right now in the middle of the COVID crisis. So even if the strategic needs are there for having a stronger cooperation with Mexico, this doesn't look to be the time when the US can orient more resources towards that direction.
Thank you, Juan Fernando. So since we do have Cristian Michel from the Cámara Suizo-Mexicana de Comercio en Industria, who is probably an expert in Mexico, of course, he's there now. Maybe you have some follow-up comments?
Oh my God, thank you. I wasn't prepared for this, but maybe something on top of my mind is that I mean, we do have a relationship with the Mexican foreign officials at the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, and they are worried because they know the channels on how to contact the Trump administration, and they're worried on this new Biden-Harris administration because they basically have to start from scratch, and immigration is a big issue that is worrying them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cristian. I didn't mean to put you on the spot right there, but I do think that you probably had, I do believe that you have very interesting points and something of value to add. So thank you for that. Yeah, so now we're going to open up the floor to questions from everybody else. Of course, you can ask them directly or write them down in the chat. If not, I will keep firing away, but I would also like for this to be a bit more interactive. So I hope that some more questions show up in the chat. So maybe we can, while people are writing down their questions, we can maybe shift gears and start addressing Brazil. So let's talk about Brazil as well. So for all three of the panelists, do you think that Biden can deal with Bolsonaro? So what are Biden's policies in relation to sustainability, for example, and will he call for a stop to the environmental devastation and deforestation taking place in the Amazon? Juan Fernando.
May I go first, if you,
yes, please.
If you allow me? Since I have to leave in 4 minutes because I have to moderate a panel on migration later on, I would like to try to give the first answer to this question and to say to you that I'm also very thankful for your invitation and for the participation in this panel, and that I have enjoyed very much all your insights and learned very much in this event. When you ask that question, I think about the same question that we were asking to ourselves 4 years ago, like, would we be able to deal with Trump? Would President Macron be able to deal with Donald Trump? This was the kind of question, and the question comes because of course, Bolsonaro is also an unpredictable character, as Trump has proved to be. I would say that one thing is important, when we understand the new relations between President Biden and President Bolsonaro is that there is more and more consensus on climate change today than before. And this, you can see this consensus in the US population, now in the President of the United States, in European countries, but also in China, for instance. So what we would see in Bolsonaro's Brazil is growing and growing isolation in terms of discourse that goes against promoting actions against climate change. So maybe we can see a stubborn Bolsonaro dealing with that or not. This is something that we don't know yet because this is a very unpredictable president. But we can be sure that if stubbornness and, let's say, reluctance is the choice, it will come with a price, with a higher price than what it had to pay, what Brazil had to pay in the last 4 years. And with that small answer, I really thank you all for your presence, and I send you warm greetings from Medellín and from Colombia, and I hope to have the chance to see you again once again. All my very best.
Juan Fernando, thank you very much, and I'm sorry you have to go, but I know that you have other things to tend to, so a big round of applause for you, and I look forward to seeing you very soon as well. And I'm glad that the other two panelists are also staying for a couple more questions. Thank you, Juan Fernando, very much for your contribution. So before we move on to another question, then can maybe get some feedback from Brantley and Claudia, if anything?
I just wanted to, it's a bit unfair to do this now that he has just left, but I just wanted to add that we cannot really talk about a national consensus in the US when it comes to climate change and sustainability issues. If we look at the exit polls and preoccupations of voters, we see a neatly divided country when it comes to, do you believe in climate change or not, or that it's man-made, etc., between Republican and Democratic voters. And so we cannot really say that there is a national consensus. And a lot of the plans with regards to sustainability and green energy that come with the Biden administration are really directed towards domestic efforts. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest caveats with all that we're discussing. I think most of the energy of this administration will, in the beginning stages, be inwards oriented. On the one hand, because of the pandemic that needs to be taken control of, the recession that will determine also the midterm elections. We also have to think that this administration will be in campaign mode quicker than we probably anticipate. And so a lot of energies will go into that. And that is also a concern for those who care about other policy areas. But I think that's going to be the reality. And with regards to dealing with gentlemen of a more temperamental sort, I think what we have to be a bit cautious about is we don't really know who will be head of Secretary of State, who will be the security advisor. I think that will also determine a bit the approach towards a foreign policy in general. And another matter is that we need to take into consideration is that we have now a president who has an extreme network in the world and who has dealt with all sorts of leaders already. We've probably the best connected president ever, entering the office with an enormous experience in foreign policy. And I think he will, in his approach with any foreign leader, have the same mixture of pragmatism and strong arming that has always shaped US foreign policy to an extent.
Thank you, Claudia. Brantley?
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Claudia is saying. I think that the tone will be more inward looking, especially at first, just because that's just the moment, that's the zeitgeist, it's a more inward looking country politically at the moment. And I also don't know if exactly dealing with Bolsonaro is quite the right way to frame it or the right question, as far as I'm concerned, because I don't necessarily want an implication that the United States should be returned to the business of encouraging or ousting a leader, even if it's through democratic means, and to get another leader that maybe would be more cozy to their message. So I would doubt that maybe that's going to be something that Biden would want to risk any political capital on. In terms specifically of climate change and deforestation, I think that it won't come directly from the United States, but from multilateral institutions. I think that those institutions, such as the United Nations, will have a lot more wind in their sails with a Biden administration as opposed to a Trump administration. So the case could be made for dealing with things in the Amazon, which, you know, Bolsonaro would present. The deforestation is really presenting livelihood for local farmers. You have to show them that really this is something that benefits the rest of the world, and that shouldn't be a burden to him. So maybe through those multilateral institutions come up with financial incentives to discourage deforestation.
Great, thank you. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes left in today's Zoom symposium. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One is from Aaron Castroverde. I don't know if Aaron wants to ask the question himself, or otherwise I can read it out loud.
Sure. I was wearing my pajama top here, so I didn't want to offend anybody. But
we accept pajama tops, Aaron, so I think it's okay. We don't accept showers normally.
Yeah, the new normal and all, you know.
So thank you very much for your very important questions. Please, if you want to read them.
Sure. You know, I mean, for me to think about this, like again, taking out these, maybe we could say more extreme leftist positions, if you want, we could put them back in there later, you know, perhaps, but, you know, besides Cuba, Venezuela, maybe Nicaragua, maybe even Bolivia, as of what, 4 days ago, you know, how do we see a relationship between the new administration and, again, let's say center-left parties, you know what I mean? Let's, you know, mainstream center-left parties in Latin America. I know, Brantley, you did mention the idea of, like, again, the strength of the dollar and how that's going to affect things. But, you know, that seems to me like, again, you know, maybe there is some kind of ideological affinity or some kind of, you know, we want to help this, you know, like say Argentina or whatever. But then again, there is the dollar, right? You know, obviously, you know, our foreign policy is going to, you know, United States is going to look at the United States first, right? You know, but again, I don't know if there's something that's going to perhaps change in any of this stuff or not, you know. So I'll put that out there as the first one.
Yeah, should we just go ahead and answer directly, Rocío? Yeah, yes. No, thanks. That's a fascinating question. I don't necessarily think of it this as being like, will this benefit the left or the right in the United States? I think that really Biden's a victory symbolically or not for centrism. And I think that you have a lot of countries literally rewriting themselves in the sense of Chile right now. I mean, people have not only been in the streets in the United States this summer, it's practically every country in the hemisphere. And of course it goes well beyond that, but we're focusing on the Americas here. So I think that this is, you know, will there necessarily be more of a willingness to work with the left or the right? I don't really anticipate that, but I do think that this will show that, you know, a lot of people look toward the United States and what's going on in the current moment as kind of the art of the possible. And if the art of the possible looks to be building by consensus and centrist government, I think that you might potentially see more. I would hope a lessening of populism throughout the Americas and an attempt, especially when things like new constitutions are being negotiated, an attempt to reach consensus and not just swing in one way or the other.
I think, yeah, Brantley made a very important point, because I think we cannot stress enough how unideological this administration will be. Biden doesn't have a clear political theory in that sense. If you read his books, etc., he is someone who is really very much driven by a pragmatism, very US pragmatism, and it doesn't really have a philosophy of how to how to govern. It's a what is feasible. And the interesting thing is his vice president is of the same mold. There has been a tendency to caricature her as an extremely liberal a senator, but I mean, her voting record, yes, was liberal, but it's very easy to be liberal in the Senate. And she has a very different record as an attorney general of California and a prosecutor. And so she is also driven by a very pragmatist outlook. And I think, therefore, ideological affinities will be less important than personal affinities, because Biden is someone who very much works by personal relations. It's also, Kamala Harris was a pick because they have both the similar political instincts, but she also had this personal tie already to him. And this matters a lot. And I think countries will benefit, even though this isn't a very political science way of looking at things, but they will benefit when they are also have heads of state that are able to connect with Biden on a very personal level, because that's how he functions.
Well, this leads me to the second question, which to me is really where I want to go, because I want nothing short of utopian conjectures. What would a US government that actually benefits Latin America look like, in your opinion here? Go ahead and lay out the whole manifesto. I'd like to hear this for both of you here.
I think that was the easiest question so far.
Claudia, how do you feel about utopian conjecture? Because it's, along with Mexico, not my strong suit.
I love utopias, but I'm not very good at determining, I mean, Latin America as such. I think probably every Latin America country would have its own utopian vision of how US relations should be projecting. And I think it would probably have to do with, in all cases, though, with a sense of equal partnership, and particularly, let's say, a more, how shall I say, a consciousness for the effects on Latin America of US domestic politics. Brantley, you mentioned, for instance, drug politics. And I think a lot of Americans are simply not aware what devastation they cause on the entire Latin American sphere. And for instance, just to be more conscious of the effects of domestic politics on the Latin American sphere as such, and a sense of not treating them as unequal partners, because that has been also the tendency in the renegotiations of the NAFTA with the US, what's it called now, US Mexico Canada, or US Canada Mexican deal. So I think equality would be a nice vision, but again, I think it would depend very much on each country.
Yeah, I largely agree. And I would say I tend more toward pragmatism than utopianism myself, so my answer will be very boring. And that's that I think stability is probably the best thing, and that's stability throughout Latin America, promoting consensus-driven agendas domestically, but also a stable global economy that will continue to fuel a commodity boom that is going to bankroll a lot of Latin American countries, but also a stable governance that is going to set a model for other countries. So perhaps the IMF and the World Bank, when they are looking to invest in countries that have a history of populism, maybe if we enter into a world order of centrism, I'm not holding my breath on that, but you asked for my version of utopia. If we entered into that, they'd be much more willing to lend money with confidence and at low rates if we weren't living in a milieu of real swings to the left and the right.
Good. There you go, Aaron. You've got a couple of your answers there.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you as well for your questions. Professor Sanchez had a question for Juan Fernando, but
yeah, perhaps the other two know it too. The Pew survey on trust, and we have the 16% for Trump. So how can you explain the gap between voters and 16% trust on Trump? Was it a national survey? That was my question, or was it an international survey? That was the
Was that the
slide
survey that? Oh.
Juan Fernando showed this slide on trust on the leaders, and Trump had 16% only. So I was wondering, was it national? And if national, why the gap between the almost 50% and the 16%? Or was it international? Then it's clear, you know. That was my question, but you don't know. Or Brantley, perhaps? No. Okay. So I will ask it. I will ask Juan. But the trust question is really very relevant.
Right, and the discrepancy in these percentages. But we will email Juan Fernando and try to get an answer from him. So we have one more question in the chat before we start wrapping things up, and it's Savannah Todd. Savannah, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Hi, yes, sure. I'm one of Mr. Brantley's students and a couple of other teachers who are here from Georgia College. I'm also their student, so hi.
Thank you very much for being with us, Savannah.
Yeah, it's been awesome. You guys have had a lot of really interesting things to say. I guess this is a little bit kind of a digression from where we've been talking so far, but we've talked a little bit about how the president and this Biden election will affect immigration. And I wanted to get a little more into the nitty gritty of that and ask for either of both panelists, depending on who feels comfortable answering. Regarding immigration from a US perspective, do you think President Biden will change, preferably decrease or eliminate the quotas for immigration judges, which are largely Republican because they had a lot of appointments during the Trump administration? As a follow-up, do you think, or you guys can answer that first question because we might run out of time and I don't want to go over.
I'll just give a little bit of context, and I'll leave that one to Claudia because she focuses more specifically on the United States than I do. Thanks for the question. Great to see you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so I think that potentially, however, if we zoom out a little bit more, I do think that maybe it's a little bit misleading to think of the parties as having a singular immigration policy, as the Republicans for necessarily being against immigration and the Democrats for necessarily being for it, because there are movements within both parties. Of course, the more libertarian wing of the Republican Party would be more for immigration. And also, as Claudia discussed and broke down in her presentation, there's a real movement as recently as George W. Bush who championed the idea of Latin American immigration as a strategy to win over more Republicans in places like Texas. The philosophy being that these are voters that will likely side with Republicans more than Democrats. Of course, on the Democratic side, yeah, there's certainly the way at least the party is branded right now as being much friendlier toward immigration. However, if we think of the economic maxim as strong workers' rights and free-flowing immigration being really not compatible with each other, I think there's also a branch of the Democratic Party who's not necessarily going to be all for immigration. So I think that it's all that to muddy the waters of an excellent question. Sorry, and then I'll turn it over to Claudia to deal with all the fallout.
I cannot deal with all of it because I'm not sure whether he has the power to decrease or eliminate these quotas. I have no idea whether he can, because I have a feeling that he's not possibly, he cannot do that as easily as one would hope to. And the second part of your question is also he is a bit in troubled water when it comes to generally privatized enforcement of all types of policies. So both in the immigration and in the penalty in penal law, he has sometimes very limited possibilities because some of that goes into state jurisdiction. There have been those calling for a more federal approach to that, but it's questionable whether that he would prioritize that. But generally, I think what Brantley said is important to highlight, that there have been a lot of bipartisan efforts to reform immigration law. We have to think back to the Gang de Ocho, that was really also at the basis of going towards the Great Dream Act. And given the record of Biden as a senator, we can hope that he might be able to stir against some bipartisan action on that level, but that's also maybe a bit utopian. So sorry of not being able to answer your interesting question.
No, thank you. It's more or less a hypothetical anyway, because we have no, like, we have nothing to base any kind of judgment off of because he's not in office yet. So I appreciate you attempting.
Thank you very much for your question, Savannah. I'm sorry we will not get a chance to go to the second part, but yes, thank you for putting it there as well. There is an important comment here in the chat from Virginia Tehran. Would Virginia like to read it herself, or should I do it?
Hi, everyone. This has nothing to do with the relationship with Latin American countries and the effect of the election. It's more a linguistic anthropological comment. It's in the chat and I will read it. I would like to just make a comment. I said it's very important to start reflecting in these intellectual circles on the role of language. You talked about tone. I am talking about language. For example, the expression, and I heard Claudia, you referred to illegal immigration or immigrants used by some of us. Rosa 2019, Jonathan Rosa, he's in Stanford University. He's an associate professor. He's amazing. He does research on racial linguistics. He published an article called Contesting Representations of Migrant Illegality Through the Drop the I campaign. And he holds that the term illegal is an oxymoronic term, since according to the US Immigration and Nationality Act, immigrant defines a person that was lawfully admitted to live in the United States. Rosa also considers that the word illegal to refer to immigrants is criminalizing and stereotyping. And he claims that illegal cannot accurately describe people but actions. And here, if we infringe the law by, I don't know, what is it? We infringe a traffic law, we would not call that person illegal, right? So we need to be very careful when we talk about illegal immigration. In 2012, the Society of Linguistic Anthropology, the Committee of Language and Justice, Social Justice, they drafted a statement that was endorsed by dozens of linguistic anthropologists, by which media outlets changed their style guidelines and dropped the I word. So nowadays, in the media in the United States, you will not tend to hear about illegal immigration, but unauthorized or undocumented. And so that's my comment.
Thank you, Virginia, for that comment. I think also Larissa da Silva Rajo agrees with this. Claudia.
My apologies. I'm in Republican lingo sometimes because that's where I do my research. And we have to say that in mainstream politics, it's still the way it's talked, but you're of course right. We hear more the terminology undocumented or unauthorized. And one of the major issues that the Biden administration still has to tackle with is decriminalizing border crossings. That is one of the issues that makes basically criminalizes a lot of migrants from the get-go, and that has been a promise by certain Democratic candidates in the primaries, but so far not by Joe Biden. So it will be interesting to see whether he'll tackle that.
But the issue, if I may say, of this term, of eliminating this term, has been on tables of universities and scholars for a long time. It's not, Rosa is not the first one to claim this in 2019. It has been there always. So I think this claim of having it in academic circles changed. I think we are on the way, and the claim has been there for many years already.
Mm-hmm. So it's I can see now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty, which is very exciting, but we have run out of time. So I'm very sorry. It did fly by. So maybe one final comment, if our panelists still have the energy and brain power to add one last final remark, if you choose something that you want us to walk away with, perhaps?
I mean, I think we've had great questions. I think that the presentations really played off each other in a great way. So we've had a really good exploration. I would like to say thank you for organizing this, and thank you for the attendance and also the great comments. Maybe we need to just now put a wait and see approach and do it again in 2 years and see where it all lands.
I was just about to say that I will invite you to a reunion in 2 and 4 years' time to see how some of your projections and comments will have delivered or not.
So I'm currently reading this, Promise Me, Dad. I think there are lots of promises that are made by this administrations and a lot of hopes that are projected into it. And I hope that we see them come into fruition. That's my desire, and it would be wonderful to see whether we can say in 2 years when the midterms are up that a lot has changed.
Exactly. So I would now invite everybody to maybe turn on their microphones if you can, or if you want, and give a great big round of applause to our panelists.
Yes.
Yeah.
You guys are awesome. That was great.
Yes, wonderful. So it's just basically, I'm going to take 30 seconds to thank everybody very, very much. Everybody that has participated here, who has joined us from different parts of Latin America, different parts of the United States, and different parts of Switzerland and Europe. PT Dr. Claudia Brühwiler from the University of St. Gallen here in Switzerland, I thank you very much for your tremendous contribution today. Dr. Brantley Nicholson from Georgia College in the United States, I thank you also very much for your amazing points. And in absentia, Dr. Juan Fernando Palacio from the UPB Medellín in Colombia, we also thank him. So thank you once again to everybody. I will upload the video in the SSLAS.org website, and as well as the PowerPoint presentations. And we also look forward to seeing you again in some of the Swiss School of Latin American Studies events in the future. Thank you again, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.